Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar. As it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. So here, Paul is actually not saying that circumcision has value and that being a Jew has value. In other words, observing Judaism and Mosaic customs, the laws of Moses. He's not saying that that has value in the church right now. Paul actually argues against that a lot. And in fact, in the previous chapter, he's just said a very radical statement that a Jew is not a Jew who is one outwardly, who has the law outwardly or is circumcised outwardly, but a Jew is one on the inside, in their heart, and who has been circumcised in their heart. And this comes through the Spirit, through believing the gospel. And Paul spent the previous chapter telling people not to rely on law and circumcision and self-righteousness, but to put their faith in Christ. The value that he's talking about in being a Jew and in circumcision is the history and the heritage of the Jewish people. That God's salvation plan came through the Jewish people. It started in Abraham, where God called Abraham out of the Gentiles, and God made a covenant with Abraham. And this was actually a covenant of grace and a covenant of faith. And he promised to bless Abraham. And God said, through you, Abraham, through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that was God's salvation plan, that through Abraham's seed, which is Christ, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, which means salvation, righteousness, the Spirit will come to all the nations of the world. And this will come through Christ, but it comes through Israel and the Jewish people. And it was always important for Paul to honor the Jews and to honor Israel because of this heritage. And so here he's honoring them, saying, no, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. The law and the prophets came through the Jewish people. And the law and the prophets is what pointed towards Christ. And so if it wasn't for the Jewish people, salvation actually wouldn't have come to the world. And so Paul is very honoring of Israel. And so during those covenants, circumcision was important, observing the law was important, but they were never the fulfillment. They were never the substance. They were always only the shadow. And Christ is the fulfillment. And anytime Jewish people were rejecting Christ and rejecting the substance, the fulfillment, and choosing to rather go after the shadow, then Paul always had a problem and an issue with them. And so who is Paul talking about when he says, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? I believe he's talking about Israel who went under the law, and they actually chose to go under the law under Moses. Israel was actually under Abraham and in a grace covenant, and God gave them the option to go under the law, and they chose to go under the law, but they shouldn't have. They should have stayed in Abraham, because as soon as they went under the law, judgment came, sin came. Because under Abraham, they sinned and they weren't judged. And you can study the history. Even coming out of Egypt, Israel was grumbling and complaining, and God didn't judge them. In fact, he blessed them. He opened up the Red Sea, he fed them, he gave them water, he protected them, and they were grumbling and complaining. As soon as the law came and they were sinning, and then they grumbled and complained, judgment came, and many of them died. And that is because they came out of a grace covenant under Abraham and came into a different covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and that was a covenant based on their performance. But under Abraham, it was a covenant with God based on faith and on grace. And so Israel actually going under the law showed their unfaithfulness, because as soon as the law came, we saw sin abounded. Sin was revealed. In fact, Romans 5 says that because of sin, the law came. And God never brought the law to make Israel righteous. He actually brought the law to reveal to Israel how sinful they were. And all of that was to actually point to the coming Messiah one day, who was the seed of Abraham. And so God actually used this period of Israel under the law to demonstrate to the world how impossible it is to relate to God through your own self-righteousness. And we'll see in Romans, it reveals that we wouldn't have known what sin was unless it was by the law. And Romans 9 even talks about, what if God chose to reveal his wrath and power to the objects of his wrath, that is Israel under the law, and that he did this to make known the riches of his grace and his mercy to the objects of his mercy. And that is everyone who believes in Christ and has faith in Christ. But the period of Israel under the law was actually to show the world that God doesn't want us to relate to him through our works and our own self-righteousness. That all that happens when we do that is judgment and curse and punishment. And that is the history of Israel under the law. It's not a happy history. There's a few moments of joy and happiness with some terrible prolonged periods of unhappiness and wrath and judgment. And this, like Romans 9 says, was to demonstrate and to show the world how futile it is to try to relate to God through our works. And so I believe in verse 3 here, when it talks about what if some were unfaithful, I believe it's talking about Israel who went under the law. It says, even though they were unfaithful, God is still faithful. God had promised to Abraham, I will bless you and make you a blessing to the nation. But here Israel was not being a blessing to the nation. They were unfaithful to God. But it doesn't mean that God was unfaithful to his promises. And so some people might accuse God of being unfaithful to his promises and to the promise of Abraham. And people would have said, where is this coming Messiah? Where is this fulfillment? Where is this hope? Where is this deliverer? Why has God forgotten about Israel? Has God abandoned Israel? Has God broken his promise? And Paul here says, no, by no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar. And in that whole period of Israel being under the law and being unfaithful to God and walking away from God and coming back and walking away and coming back and eventually just breaking covenant, walking away from God. And there was silence between the covenants for 400 years. God hadn't spoken. And it looked like God wasn't being faithful. And perhaps many people would have accused God in that time of being unfaithful. And the word says, no, let God be true and everyone else a liar. If God promised it, which he did, he promised it to Abraham. And if God promised it, it was going to happen. And so all of those going-ons under the law was actually God working out his salvation plan into this world. And so there are many who would have accused God of being unfaithful. And even in the new covenant, there are many who twist the gospel to mean something else. And Paul actually goes on to talk about that